Chapter 1. A Child of the Land. Nelson Mandela was born on July 18, 1918, in a small village called Mvezo in the rolling hills of South Africa. His family belonged to the Xhosa people, one of the proud tribes of the region. Nelson's real name was Rolihlahla. In his language, it meant pulling the branch of a tree, but people often said it meant troublemaker. Little did they know how much he would grow to shake the world. Rolihlahla's home was simple. His family lived in a small, round hut with a grass roof. There were no roads, no electricity, and no running water. His mother, Nosekeni, worked hard to fetch water from the river and cook meals over an open fire. The family ate food grown in their fields, corn, beans, and sweet potatoes. Life was hard, but it was peaceful. As a boy, Rolihlahla loved to play. He ran barefoot through the fields, climbed trees, and swam in the river. He listened to the wind rustling through the tall grass and watched the stars light up the night sky. The land felt alive to him, full of stories and secrets. But his favorite times were when the elders would gather. They sat under big trees and told tales of their ancestors. Rolihlahla listened with wide eyes. He learned about the great leaders of the past, warriors who had fought to protect their people. These stories stayed in his heart, planting seeds of courage and pride. Rolihlahla's father, Gadla, was a respected chief. People came to him for advice and help. They trusted him because he was fair and wise. Rolihlahla admired his father deeply. He wanted to be just like him, strong, brave, and kind. But life changed suddenly for the young boy. When Rolihlahla was only 9, his father became very ill. Gadla could no longer speak or walk properly. One quiet evening, he passed away. Rolihlahla sat beside his father's body, holding back tears. He was too young to understand fully, but he felt a great loss. After Gadla's death, life in Mvezo became difficult for the family. Rolihlahla's mother decided to move to another village called Kunu, where they could live with relatives. Kunu was different, but it became a happy place for Rolihlahla. He found joy in helping with chores and exploring the countryside. It was in Kunu that Rolihlahla started to dream of a different kind of life. His mother sent him to a small school nearby, the first in his family to ever attend. On his first day, his teacher asked for his name. When he said Rolihlahla, she smiled and said, "From now on, your name will be Nelson." Nelson? It was a strange name, one he didn't understand, but it became part of him, marking the beginning of a new chapter in his life. At school, Nelson learned to read and write. He was curious about everything. He asked questions, loved stories, and wanted to know how the world worked. Education opened his mind to new ideas, but it also raised questions. Why were black children sent to schools with so few books? Why did white people seem to have so much more? At home, Nelson continued to learn from his family and community. His mother taught him the value of kindness and humility. She showed him how to respect others, even when times were hard. The elders in Kunu taught him about the customs of their people. He learned how to greet others properly, how to honor his ancestors, and how to hold his head high with pride. One day, Nelson was sent to live with a powerful chief named Jongintaba Dalindyebo. Jongintaba was the acting regent of the Thembu people, and he took Nelson into his home as a ward. Nelson felt nervous when he arrived. The chief's home was much grander than anything he had ever known, but he was grateful for the opportunity. Living with Jongintaba changed Nelson's life. The chief treated him like a son and gave him a chance to study at better schools. Nelson learned about leadership by watching Jongintaba make decisions. He saw how the chief listened to his people and tried to solve their problems. Even though Nelson was young, he began to notice the unfairness in the world around him. Black people like him were treated as second-class citizens. They had to carry passes to prove where they were allowed to go. They could not vote or own land. It made Nelson angry, but he also felt powerless. At night, when the house was quiet, Nelson would lie awake thinking. He thought about the stories of brave leaders he had heard as a boy. He thought about his father's strength and his mother's kindness. He wondered if one person could make a difference in such an unfair world. One day, Nelson saw something that stayed with him forever. He was walking through the village when he saw a group of white men beating a black man. The man was on the ground, begging them to stop, but they kept hitting him. Nelson wanted to help, but he was too scared. He stood frozen, his fists clenched. Later, he told himself, "One day, I will fight against this. One day, I will make it stop." Back at school, Nelson began to work harder than ever. He knew education was his way forward. He studied English, history, and politics. He learned about leaders from around the world, people who had fought for justice and equality. These stories inspired him. When Nelson wasn't studying, he loved to play sports. He joined his school's track and boxing teams. Sports taught him discipline and teamwork. They also gave him a chance to prove himself, to show that he was strong and capable. Through it all, Nelson remained deeply connected to his heritage. He never forgot the lessons of his childhood, the value of hard work, the strength of his ancestors, and the power of standing together as a community. As Nelson grew older, his dreams grew too. He no longer wanted to just help his family or his village. He wanted to help his people, everyone who was suffering under the unfair system of apartheid. But Nelson was still young. He didn't know how he would make a difference. He didn't know what challenges lay ahead. All he knew was that he couldn't give up. The boy who had once run through the fields of Kunu was now a young man with a burning desire for change. The seeds of courage planted in his heart as a child were beginning to grow. His journey was only beginning. This was the story of a child who loved his land, his people, and justice. A child who would one day grow into one of the greatest leaders the world had ever known. Chapter 2. A Name to Remember. Rolilala was 7 years old when his mother took him to his first day of school. He was nervous, but also excited. It was a cool morning in Kunu, and the sound of birds filled the air. His mother held his hand tightly as they walked along the dusty path. He wore his best clothes, a simple shirt and shorts. His mother had washed them the night before and ironed them with care. When they arrived at the small one-room school, Rolilala stared at the building. It was not like anything he had seen before. The walls were made of mud bricks, and the roof was thatched with straw. Inside, wooden benches and a blackboard waited for the children. "Be a good boy," his mother whispered. She kissed him on the forehead and left him at the door. Rolilala wanted to follow her, but he stayed. He was determined to be brave. The teacher, Miss Mandela, was a kind woman with a strong voice. She smiled at the children and told them to sit down. Rolilala chose a spot near the back of the room. He looked around shyly. Some children were his age, but others were much older. Miss Dingane began by asking each child their name. One by one, they stood up and spoke. When it was Rolilala's turn, he stood up slowly. His heart pounded in his chest. "What is your name?" she asked. "Rolilala," he said softly. Miss Mandela nodded. Then she said something that surprised him. "From now on, your name will be Nelson." Nelson? Rolilala had never heard this name before. He didn't know why she had chosen it. It felt strange, like wearing someone else's clothes, but he didn't ask questions. He simply nodded and sat down. Years later, Nelson would learn why his teacher had given him this name. During colonial times, it was common for African children to be given English names at school. The colonizers believed African names were too difficult to pronounce. For them, it was easier to replace them. For the rest of the day, Nelson tried to focus on the lessons. Miss Mandela taught the children how to write simple words, how to add numbers, and how to read short sentences. Nelson's hand trembled as he held the pencil. Writing was hard at first. His letters were uneven, and the pencil felt awkward in his small hand. But he was determined to learn. After school, Nelson walked home alone. The sun was setting, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink. He thought about his new name. He whispered it softly to himself. Nelson? Nelson? It still felt strange, but he began to get used to it. At home, Nelson told his mother about his day. She smiled proudly and said, "You are the first in our family to go to school. Learn well, my son." Nelson loved school. Each day, he learned something new. He discovered stories about other lands and people. He learned about history, science, and math. Every lesson felt like a door opening to a bigger world. But school was also confusing. Nelson began to notice that the world wasn't fair. He read stories about kings and queens in faraway countries. They lived in castles, wore fine clothes, and ruled over their people. Nelson wondered, why were there no black kings or queens in his books? Why did his people seem invisible in the stories? One day, Miss Ndingane told the class about South Africa's laws. She explained that black people had fewer rights than white people. Nelson felt a spark of anger. He didn't understand why the world was this way, but even as a boy, he knew it was wrong. Outside of school, life was still simple. Nelson helped his family with chores. He herded cattle in the fields and fetched water from the river. At night, he sat by the fire with his mother and siblings. The stars above were bright and endless. Sometimes, Nelson's mother would tell him stories about their ancestors. She spoke about warriors and chiefs who had defended their people. She told him about the Xhosa's long history and their struggles against invaders. Nelson listened carefully, his eyes shining. He felt proud of his heritage. At school, Nelson learned about another kind of leader. Miss Ndingane told the class about Abraham Lincoln, the American president who had fought to end slavery. She spoke of George Washington, who had helped his country gain independence. Nelson admired these men. He dreamed of one day becoming a leader too. But life in Kunu wasn't just about dreams. It was also about survival. Nelson saw how hard his mother worked to provide for the family. Her hands were rough from carrying heavy loads of water and firewood. Her face was lined with worry. One evening, Nelson asked his mother, "Why do we have to work so hard?" His mother looked at him with tired eyes. "Because this is our life," she said. "But you can change it, my son. Study hard. Learn all you can. One day you might do something great." Her words stayed with Nelson. He didn't know what he would do, but he felt a growing sense of purpose. As the years passed, Nelson's love for learning grew. He read every book he could find. He asked questions in class and worked hard to understand the answers. He loved history most of all. It made him feel connected to the past and gave him hope for the future. But Nelson also felt the weight of his new name. It was a reminder of the world he lived in, a world where black children were taught to fit into a system created by others. Nelson didn't know how to change this yet, but he promised himself one thing. He would never forget who he really was. At school, Nelson's teachers often praised him for his hard work. "You are a bright boy," they would say. "You can go far." Their words encouraged him, but they also made him feel the pressure to succeed. He wanted to make his family proud. One day, Nelson stood outside the schoolhouse, looking at the hills in the distance. He thought about his father, who had once been a leader in their village. He thought about his ancestors, who had fought for their people's freedom. He thought about his mother, who believed in him. Nelson clenched his fists and whispered to himself, "I will do something important. I don't know what it is yet, but I will find a way." The boy who had walked into school as Rolilahla was now Nelson, but deep inside he was still the same child, a child of the land, of his people, and of hope. This was just the beginning of his journey. The path ahead would be long and full of challenges, but Nelson Mandela was ready to take the first step, and then the next. Chapter 3. Discovering Injustice. Nelson Mandela was still a young man when he left the rolling hills of Kunu for the busy streets of Johannesburg. The city was like nothing he had ever seen before. Tall buildings reached toward the sky, cars roared down wide roads, and people hurried everywhere. It was loud, crowded, and full of energy. But beneath the excitement, Nelson began to notice something troubling, something deeply wrong. As he walked through the city, he saw how differently people lived. In the neighborhoods where white South Africans lived, the streets were clean, and the houses were large and beautiful. Children played in big gardens. Their parents wore fine clothes and seemed to walk without worry. But when Nelson walked to the areas where black South Africans lived, it was like entering a different world. Small, crowded shacks lined the streets. The air smelled of smoke and sewage. Families squeezed into tiny rooms with no electricity or running water. Children played barefoot in the dirt, their faces thin from hunger. Nelson could not believe his eyes. How could life be so unfair? The system of apartheid had created this division. Under apartheid, South Africa's government made strict laws separating people by race. Black South Africans could not live in the same neighborhoods as white South Africans. They could not go to the same schools, eat at the same restaurants, or even use the same public toilets. Everything was divided, and the white minority controlled it all. Nelson began to feel anger rise inside him. He thought about his mother's hard work and the struggles of his people back home. Now he saw that the problem was not just poverty. It was a system designed to keep black South Africans poor and powerless. One day, Nelson walked past a group of workers standing in a line. They wore worn-out clothes, their faces tired and sunburned. A white man stood in front of them, shouting orders. The workers nodded and hurried to do what he said. Nelson stopped and watched. These men looked strong and capable, yet they were treated like children. He clenched his fists. Why was this allowed? Why didn't anyone stop it? Nelson began to ask questions. He talked to his friends, his teachers, and even strangers. Everywhere he went, he heard the same stories. Black South Africans were paid low wages for long hours of work. They were forced to carry passbooks, small documents that showed where they were allowed to go. If they were caught without a passbook, they could be arrested. One evening, Nelson saw something that shook him to his core. He was walking down a quiet street when he heard shouting. Ahead, a group of policemen was beating a black man. The man was on the ground, crying for help. Nelson wanted to rush forward, to stop them, but fear held him back. He stood frozen, watching the scene. When it was over, the policeman walked away, laughing. The man lay motionless on the ground. Nelson's heart pounded. He had never felt so helpless or so angry. That night, he could not sleep. The image of the beaten man stayed in his mind. This must change, Nelson thought. But how? Nelson's search for answers led him to new places and people. He began attending meetings of the African National Congress, ANC, a group of activists fighting for the rights of black South Africans. At first, he just listened. The speakers talked about equality, justice, and the need for change. They spoke with passion and hope, even though the challenges seemed enormous. Nelson was inspired. He began to see that he was not alone in his anger. There were others who felt the same way, others who were ready to fight against injustice. One of the people Nelson met was Walter Sisulu, a wise and determined man who became his mentor. Walter believed that change was possible, but that it would take hard work and courage. He encouraged Nelson to study law so he could fight injustice in the courtroom. Nelson took Walter's advice. By day, he worked as a clerk in a law office. By night, he attended classes. It wasn't easy. The textbooks were difficult, and the exams were demanding. But Nelson was determined. He knew that education was a powerful weapon. As Nelson learned more about apartheid, his anger grew. He read about laws that stripped black South Africans of their land, their freedom, and their dignity. He heard stories of families torn apart, of children who could not go to school because their parents were too poor. But Nelson also began to see hope. He saw people standing up, speaking out, and refusing to give in to fear. He saw ordinary men and women becoming leaders, their voices growing louder with each protest. One day, Nelson attended a peaceful march in the city center. Hundreds of people gathered, holding signs that read, "Equal rights for all," and "End apartheid now." Nelson felt a surge of pride as he joined the crowd. Together, their voices echoed through the streets. But the police arrived quickly. They shouted at the protesters to leave. When the crowd refused, the police used force. They hit people with batons and fired tear gas into the air. Nelson ran as chaos erupted around him. When he reached safety, he looked back at the scene. Smoke filled the air, and people were screaming. But Nelson also saw something else. He saw courage. The protesters did not give up, even as they were pushed and beaten. That night, Nelson made a decision. He would join the fight for justice. He did not know exactly how, but he knew he could not stand by and do nothing. The injustice he had seen was too great to ignore. In the months that followed, Nelson became more involved with the ANC. He helped organize meetings, wrote pamphlets, and spoke to small groups of people. He told them what he had seen in the city and why it was time to act. Nelson's passion inspired others. His voice was strong, and his words carried hope. He believed that South Africa could be a better place, a place where all people, no matter their skin color, could live with dignity and freedom. But the road ahead was dangerous. Nelson knew that fighting against apartheid would not be easy. The government was powerful, and its laws were harsh. People who stood up for justice were often arrested, or worse. Still, Nelson felt ready. The boy from Kunu, who had once listened to stories of brave leaders, was now becoming one himself. As Nelson Mandela stood in the bustling streets of Johannesburg, he looked out at the divided city. He saw pain and poverty, but he also saw the possibility of change. He knew it would be a long journey, but he was willing to take the first step. The fight for freedom had begun. Chapter 4. The Young Lawyer. Nelson Mandela was determined to fight injustice. He believed that education was the key to freedom. While working as a clerk in Johannesburg, he spent his nights studying law. It was not easy. The books were thick, the words were complicated, and the exams were tough. But Nelson was determined to succeed. Finally, after years of hard work, Nelson Mandela became a lawyer. It was a proud moment. He had achieved something rare. In South Africa at that time, there were very few black lawyers. Most black people could not afford to study, and the system made it difficult for them to succeed. But Nelson had done it. Nelson quickly realized that being a lawyer came with great responsibility. Many black South Africans faced unfair treatment. They lost their homes, their jobs, and sometimes their freedom. The apartheid government had created laws to keep black people powerless. These laws were harsh and cruel. Nelson knew he had to use his skills to help. He teamed up with a brilliant friend named Oliver Tambo. Oliver was also passionate about justice. Together, they started South Africa's first black law firm, Mandela and Tambo Attorneys. Their office was in Johannesburg, in the heart of the city. From the moment the firm opened its doors, people came in waves. Men and women, old and young, stood in line to see them. Most of these people were poor. They couldn't afford to pay high fees, but they needed help. One day, an elderly woman walked into the office. Her face was tired, and her hands shook as she held a piece of paper. It was an eviction notice. The government had decided to take her home away, forcing her and her family to leave. "I have nowhere to go," she said softly, tears in her eyes. Nelson sat with her, listening carefully. Then he smiled gently and said, "We will fight this together." He worked tirelessly on her case and others like it. Nelson and Oliver took on cases that no one else wanted. They defended people who were arrested without reason, workers who were unfairly fired, and families who were forced out of their homes. The work was not easy. The courts were controlled by white judges, and the laws were written to favor the apartheid government. Nelson often felt frustrated. Even when he presented strong evidence, the judges rarely ruled in his favor. But he never gave up. He believed in the power of standing up for what was right. Even when the system was against him, he knew that every small victory mattered. Outside the courtroom, Nelson's reputation began to grow. People admired his courage and determination. They saw him as a leader, someone who was not afraid to speak the truth. Nelson's partnership with Oliver Tambo was also a source of strength. Oliver was calm, thoughtful, and wise. He balanced Nelson's fiery passion. Together, they made a powerful team, but their work was not without risks. The government kept a close watch on Nelson and Oliver. They did not like that two black lawyers were challenging their system. Nelson often noticed men in plain clothes standing near their office, watching them. One evening, as Nelson was walking home, he was stopped by a policeman. "Where are you going?" the officer barked. "To my home," Nelson replied calmly. The policeman stared at him, then said, "Don't think you can change things, Mandela. You'll regret it." Nelson didn't respond. He knew better than to argue, but inside his resolve grew stronger. He thought, "They can watch me, threaten me, even arrest me, but I will not stop fighting." At Mandela and Tambo, the work never slowed down. Nelson often stayed late into the night, preparing cases. His desk was piled with papers, and the sound of his pen scratching against the page filled the quiet room. One night, Oliver walked in with 2 cups of tea. He placed one on Nelson's desk and said, "You're working too hard, my friend." Nelson looked up and smiled. "We have to, Oliver. The people need us." Oliver nodded. He understood. They both knew that their work was about more than winning cases. It was about giving people hope. Nelson's fight for justice extended beyond the courtroom. He became more involved with the African National Congress, ANC. The ANC was a group that fought against apartheid. They organized protests, strikes, and marches. Nelson believed in their cause. At ANC meetings, Nelson spoke passionately. He told the audience about the injustices he saw every day, the families torn apart, the workers mistreated, the children denied an education. His words moved people. "We must fight together," he said at one meeting. "We cannot let fear stop us. The time for change is now." The crowd erupted in cheers. Nelson's voice gave them strength. But the government did not like the growing resistance. They responded with force. Police raided the homes of ANC members, arrested protesters, and banned meetings. One day, Nelson and Oliver received a notice. The government had declared their law firm a threat to public safety. They were forced to close their office. Nelson was heartbroken. He knew how much people depended on them. Closing the firm felt like a step backward, but he refused to let the government's actions defeat him. He said to Oliver, "If we can't help people as lawyers, we will help them as activists." Nelson threw himself into the fight against apartheid. He spent his days organizing protests and his nights reading about leaders like Mahatma Gandhi, who had used peaceful resistance to fight injustice. Nelson believed that change could happen if people stood together. One day, during a march, Nelson was arrested for the first time. The police accused him of organizing an illegal protest. He was taken to a small, dirty cell and locked inside. As he sat in the darkness, Nelson felt a wave of anger. But he also felt something else: determination. This was the price of fighting for freedom, and he was willing to pay it. When Nelson was released, he went straight back to work. He knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult, but he was ready. Through his work as a lawyer and an activist, Nelson Mandela became a symbol of hope. He showed people that it was possible to stand up to injustice, even in the face of great challenges. The young lawyer from Johannesburg was no longer just a man fighting individual cases. He was becoming a leader in the fight for a better South Africa. And his journey was only just beginning. Chapter 5. The Freedom Fighter. Nelson Mandela had always believed in justice. As a lawyer, he fought for people who couldn't defend themselves. But the more he worked, the more he realized something important. South Africa's problems were bigger than any single case. The entire system of apartheid was built to keep black South Africans oppressed. It wasn't enough to win in court. The laws themselves had to change. By now, Nelson was deeply involved with the African National Congress, ANC. The ANC wanted to end apartheid peacefully. They organized protests, boycotts, and strikes to challenge the government. Nelson believed in this mission. He saw the ANC as a way to bring people together and fight for freedom. In 1949, Nelson was elected to the ANC's National Executive Committee. This was a big step. It meant he had an important role in deciding how the ANC would act. He worked closely with other leaders, including Oliver Tambo and Walter Sisulu. Together, they created plans to challenge apartheid without violence. One of their first major campaigns was the Defiance Campaign in 1952. This was a peaceful protest against apartheid laws. Thousands of people joined, refusing to obey the unjust rules. They entered areas where black people were not allowed, broke curfews, and burned their passbooks. Nelson led from the front. He spoke at rallies, urging people to stand strong. "We must fight apartheid with courage," he told the crowds. "We will not be silent while our people suffer." The Defiance Campaign was powerful. It showed that people were ready to resist apartheid. But the government did not respond with understanding or change. Instead, they used violence. Police beat protesters and arrested hundreds, including Nelson. Nelson spent a few weeks in prison. The experience was harsh. The cells were cold and crowded, and the food was barely enough to survive. But Nelson refused to be broken. He used the time to think and plan. When he was released, Nelson was more determined than ever. He traveled across the country, meeting with communities and speaking about the need for unity. People admired his bravery. He became a symbol of hope. But the government saw him as a threat. They passed new laws to silence people like Nelson. One of these laws was the Suppression of Communism Act, which banned protests and restricted the activities of the ANC. Nelson and other leaders were watched closely. Their phones were tapped, and plainclothes policemen followed them everywhere. In 1956, Nelson was arrested again. This time, he and 155 others were charged with treason. The trial lasted for 5 long years. During this time, Nelson continued his work, balancing life as a lawyer, activist, and family man. The trial ended in 1961, and all the accused were found not guilty. Nelson was free again, but he knew his freedom could be taken away at any moment. The government's oppression continued to grow. Peaceful protests were met with guns and batons. Entire communities were forced out of their homes. The ANC tried to negotiate with the government, but they refused to listen. Nelson began to lose faith in peaceful methods. He still believed in justice, but he could see that the government would not change on its own. It was time for a new approach. In 1961, Nelson helped to form Umkhonto we Sizwe, which means Spear of the Nation. This was a military wing of the ANC. Its goal was not to hurt people, but to attack symbols of apartheid, government buildings, railway lines, and power stations. They wanted to show the government that the fight for freedom would not be stopped. Nelson became the leader of Umkhonto we Sizwe. It was a dangerous role. He knew the risks. If he was caught, the punishment would be severe. But Nelson was willing to make the sacrifice. "The struggle is my life," he said. To avoid arrest, Nelson went underground. He moved in secret, changing his location often. Sometimes he dressed as a worker or a driver to avoid detection. He lived apart from his family, only seeing them in brief, secret visits. It was a lonely and difficult time. During this period, Nelson became known as the Black Pimpernel. The police searched for him everywhere, but he always managed to stay one step ahead. His face was on wanted posters, and a large reward was offered for his capture. Even while underground, Nelson continued to lead. He traveled across South Africa, meeting with activists and building support for the cause. He also went abroad, visiting other countries to gain international backing for the fight against apartheid. In 1962, Nelson returned to South Africa after a trip abroad, but the government had been tracking his movements. On August 5, 1962, he was stopped by police on a quiet road outside Durban. He was arrested and taken into custody. When the news spread, people were shocked. Nelson Mandela, the Black Pimpernel, had been caught, but Nelson remained calm. He knew the fight was bigger than one man. At his trial, Nelson did not deny his actions. Instead, he explained why he had done them. "I have fought against white domination, and I have fought against black domination," he said. "I have cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society. It is an ideal for which I am prepared to die." The judge sentenced Nelson to 5 years in prison. But this was only the beginning of his time behind bars. Soon, more charges would follow, and his journey as a freedom fighter would take a new turn. Nelson Mandela's transformation from lawyer to leader was complete. He had started as a young man fighting individual cases. Now, he was a symbol of resistance, leading a nation's fight for freedom. His story was far from over. The road ahead would be even harder. But Nelson was ready to face it, no matter the cost. Before we begin, Chapter 6, a quick note for our listeners. You're currently listening to this audiobook on Woo English. Remember, this content is specially made for Woo English listeners only. If you're hearing it on any other channel, it may be a violation of Woo English's rights. Please ensure you're tuned into the right source to fully enjoy and respect this audiobook journey. Now, let's continue the story. Chapter 6. Captured. It was a quiet day on August 5th, 1962, when Nelson Mandela was traveling outside Durban. He was dressed as a chauffeur, trying to avoid suspicion. For months, he had been living in secret, moving from place to place, always watching over his shoulder. The police had been searching for him, calling him the Black Pimpernel. Now, they had found him. Nelson's car was stopped on the road. A police officer stepped forward, his face stern. "You're under arrest," he said. Nelson's heart sank, but he didn't show it. He stayed calm. He knew this day might come. The arrest shocked the nation. Nelson Mandela, the leader of the underground movement, was now in custody. People whispered in fear. What would happen to the fight for freedom? What would happen to him? The police took Nelson to jail and charged him with leaving the country without permission and inciting strikes. The trial began, and Nelson defended himself with courage. He explained why he had left South Africa to seek support for the struggle against apartheid. He spoke clearly, his voice strong. He told the court, "I am fighting for justice. I am not a criminal." Despite his defense, Nelson was sentenced to 5 years in prison. The government hoped this would silence him, but Nelson was not afraid. He believed his sacrifice was necessary for the greater good. While Nelson was in prison, the police continued their search for other leaders of the resistance. In 1963, they raided a farmhouse in Rivonia, near Johannesburg. There, they found documents linking Nelson and other ANC members to acts of sabotage against the apartheid government. The Rivonia trial began in October 1963. Nelson and 9 other men were accused of planning to overthrow the government. The charges were serious, and the punishment could be death. The courtroom was tense. Armed guards surrounded the building. Journalists from around the world came to watch. The accused stood together, their heads held high. They knew the trial was more than just a legal battle. It was a fight for the future of South Africa. The prosecutor described Nelson and his co-accused as dangerous terrorists. He painted them as enemies of the state. But Nelson was ready to defend himself. When it was his turn to speak, he stood tall and looked directly at the judge. His speech was powerful. He did not deny the charges of sabotage. Instead, he explained why he had done it. "I have fought against white domination," he said, "and I have fought against black domination. I have cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society in which all persons live together in harmony and with equal opportunities." The courtroom was silent. Everyone listened as Nelson continued. His voice was steady, full of emotion. Then he said the words that would be remembered forever. "It is an ideal which I hope to live for and achieve. But if needs be, it is an ideal for which I am prepared to die." These words sent shockwaves around the world. People admired Nelson's bravery. They saw a man willing to risk everything for his beliefs. The trial lasted for 8 long months. During this time, Nelson spent his days in a small, cold cell. At night, he thought about his family, his friends, and the future of his country. He missed his children deeply. He knew they were growing up without him. On June 12, 1964, the judge delivered the verdict. Nelson Mandela and 7 others were found guilty of sabotage. They were sentenced to life in prison. When Nelson heard the sentence, he remained calm. He had prepared himself for this moment. But inside, his heart ached. He thought of his family, the movement, and the people who depended on him. He worried about what would happen to the fight for freedom. Nelson and the other prisoners were taken to Robben Island, a bleak and isolated prison off the coast of Cape Town. The journey there was somber. The men knew they might spend the rest of their lives behind bars. On the island, life was harsh. The prisoners were forced to do hard labor, breaking rocks under the hot sun. They slept on thin mats in tiny cells. The food was poor, and the guards were cruel. Despite the conditions, Nelson refused to give up. He encouraged the other prisoners to stay strong. He reminded them that their sacrifice was for a greater cause. Back in South Africa, the Rivonia trial and Nelson's imprisonment had a profound impact. The government hoped it would crush the resistance, but instead, it inspired people to fight harder. Around the world, protests erupted. People demanded Nelson's release. They saw him as a symbol of hope and justice. His name became known in every corner of the globe. From his cell, Nelson wrote letters to his family and comrades. He couldn't say much because the guards read everything he wrote, but his words carried strength and hope. In one letter, he wrote, "We must keep fighting, even when it feels impossible. Our struggle is just, and one day we will win." The years passed slowly. Nelson missed seeing his children grow up. He missed the warmth of his wife, Winnie, and the laughter of his friends. But he never let despair take over. Nelson used his time in prison to learn. He read books about politics, philosophy, and history. He believed that knowledge was a powerful weapon against injustice. Even behind bars, Nelson Mandela remained a leader. He inspired his fellow prisoners to stay united. He negotiated with the prison authorities to improve their conditions. Slowly, he gained their respect. Nelson's imprisonment was meant to silence him, but it had the opposite effect. His voice grew louder, carried by people across South Africa and around the world. The man who had been captured on a quiet road was now a symbol of the fight for freedom. And though he was behind bars, his spirit was free. Nelson Mandela's journey was far from over. The struggle continued, and the world was watching. Chapter 7. Robben Island. Nelson Mandela arrived at Robben Island on a cold, gray day in 1964. The island was surrounded by rough, icy waters. It was quiet except for the sound of the wind and the crashing waves. This place, far from the mainland, was meant to break the spirit of its prisoners. But Nelson was determined not to let it break his. As the guards led Nelson off the boat, they shouted orders. "Keep your head down," one barked. Nelson looked straight ahead. He would not let them see fear in his eyes. The prison on Robben Island was harsh. Nelson was given a small cell, no bigger than a closet. The floor was bare, with only a thin mat to sleep on. There was a bucket for a toilet. A single window, high up on the wall, let in a sliver of light. Nelson stood in the center of the cell, taking it in. He touched the cold, rough walls. This would be his home. For how long, he did not know. The days on Robben Island were hard and cruel. Prisoners were forced to work in a limestone quarry under the blazing sun. They swung heavy pickaxes, breaking rocks into smaller pieces. The dust from the limestone filled the air, burning their eyes and throats. The guards watched over them, shouting insults and commands. They gave the prisoners little food, watery porridge for breakfast and a few scraps of bread or vegetables for dinner. Nelson often felt hungry, his stomach aching, but he never complained. At night, Nelson sat alone in his cell. He thought about his family, his wife, Winnie, and his children, who were growing up without him. He wondered if they were safe. He missed the sound of their laughter and the warmth of their hugs. But even in this loneliness, Nelson found strength. He refused to give up hope. They can take away my freedom, he thought, but they cannot take away my mind. Nelson used his time on Robben Island to learn and teach. He read every book he could find, from politics to poetry. He encouraged other prisoners to do the same. Together, they formed what they called the Robben Island University. Prisoners shared knowledge and ideas, keeping their minds sharp and their spirits alive. Nelson also found ways to stay connected to the fight for freedom. He wrote letters to his comrades outside the prison. The guards read everything he wrote, so he had to be careful. But even in his short, simple words, Nelson's message was clear. The struggle must continue. One day, Nelson received a letter from Winnie. Her words were filled with love and courage, but she also shared the struggles she faced. She was being harassed by the police. She had been arrested and interrogated. The children were suffering too. Nelson's heart ached as he read her words. He wanted to be there to protect his family, but he was powerless to help. Still, Nelson knew he had to stay strong for his family, for his comrades, and for all the people of South Africa. The years on Robben Island passed slowly. The seasons changed, but the routine stayed the same. Hard labor, small meals, and long nights in a cold cell. Yet Nelson's spirit remained unbroken. He found small ways to resist. When the guards ordered the prisoners to sing songs of loyalty to the government, Nelson and the others sang freedom songs instead. When they were told to lower their heads, Nelson stood tall. The guards tried to punish him for his defiance. They withheld letters and visits from his family. They sent him to solitary confinement. But no matter what they did, Nelson refused to give in. Over time, the guards began to notice something about Nelson. He treated them with respect, even when they were cruel. He spoke to them calmly, using reason instead of anger. Some guards began to change. They saw that Nelson was not just a prisoner. He was a leader. Nelson also became a source of inspiration for his fellow prisoners. When someone felt weak or hopeless, Nelson encouraged them. "We are not alone in this fight," he would say. "Our people are with us. The world is with us. And one day, we will be free." The limestone quarry, once a place of pain, became a place of unity. The prisoners worked together, singing as they swung their pickaxes. The rhythm of their voices echoed across the quarry, a reminder that they were still strong. But the years took their toll. The bright white dust from the limestone damaged Nelson's eyes. Even decades later, he would never fully recover his vision. His back ached from the heavy labor, and the cold nights made his bones ache. Yet, Nelson refused to focus on his own suffering. He thought about the millions of black South Africans living under apartheid. He thought about their struggles and their hopes. His pain was nothing compared to theirs, he told himself. In 1978, Nelson marked 14 years on Robben Island. 14 years of hard labor, isolation, and separation from his loved ones. Yet, he remained hopeful. The world outside was changing. The fight against apartheid was growing stronger. News from the outside reached the prisoners in small bits. They learned about protests, strikes, and boycotts. They heard about international movements calling for their release. The world was watching. By the 1980s, Nelson Mandela's name had become a symbol of freedom. People across the globe held marches and rallies demanding his release. "Free Nelson Mandela!" became a rallying cry for justice. In 1982, after 18 years on Robben Island, Nelson was transferred to Pollsmoor Prison on the mainland. The conditions there were slightly better, but his fight was far from over. Robben Island had tested Nelson Mandela in every way possible. It had tried to break him, to silence him, to erase his spirit. But instead, it made him stronger. Nelson had entered Robben Island as a prisoner. He left it as a leader, ready to continue the fight for freedom. And the world was waiting for him. Chapter 8. The Long Walk Continues. Nelson Mandela sat in his prison cell, a small bare room with a narrow bed and a tiny desk. The years passed slowly. Outside the walls of Pollsmoor Prison, the world was changing. But inside, time felt frozen. Yet, Nelson's spirit remained unbroken. His body was locked away, but his voice and his message reached far beyond the prison gates. By the 1980s, Nelson Mandela had become more than just a man. He was a symbol of freedom. His name was spoken with respect in South Africa and across the world. People admired his courage and his willingness to sacrifice for justice. The fight against apartheid did not stop when Nelson was imprisoned. In fact, it grew stronger. Inside South Africa, resistance movements became more organized. Protests, strikes, and boycotts shook the nation. Workers refused to go to their jobs. Students marched in the streets. The people demanded change. Nelson's role in this fight remained powerful. From his cell, he sent messages to his comrades. He gave advice and shared his vision for a free South Africa. These messages, smuggled out by visitors or hidden in letters, inspired those on the outside. One of Nelson's most trusted allies was his wife, Winnie Mandela. Winnie continued the struggle while Nelson was in prison. She gave speeches, led protests, and faced harassment from the government. She was arrested many times, but refused to be silenced. The government tried to weaken the resistance with violence. Police fired on protesters, killing and injuring many. Communities were torn apart, but instead of breaking the people's spirit, this brutality made them more determined. Outside of South Africa, the world began to notice. Countries around the globe spoke out against apartheid. Activists and organizations demanded Nelson Mandela's release. They held rallies and marches, calling for justice. In London, a massive concert was held in Nelson's honor at Wembley Stadium in 1988. Musicians from around the world came together to sing for freedom. The concert was broadcast to millions of people. As the crowd cheered, they shouted a single message: "Free Nelson Mandela." This cry echoed across continents. Governments, companies, and ordinary people began to take action. Many countries imposed sanctions on South Africa. This meant they stopped trading with the country or investing money there. Businesses pulled out of South Africa, and its economy began to suffer. These actions put pressure on the apartheid government. The leaders of South Africa saw that the world was turning against them. They realized they could not continue to rule with fear and violence forever. Back in prison, Nelson received letters from people around the world. Children wrote to him, telling him they admired his bravery. Activists sent messages of solidarity. These letters reminded Nelson that he was not alone. The world was watching, and people cared about his fight. But life in prison was still hard. Nelson longed to be with his family. He missed his children's birthdays and graduations. He missed the simple joy of being with loved ones. These were sacrifices he had chosen to make, but they were painful all the same. Despite the hardships, Nelson kept himself strong. He exercised daily, running in place and doing push-ups in his small cell. He read books and newspapers, staying informed about what was happening outside. He also continued to negotiate with the prison authorities, always pushing for better conditions for himself and his fellow prisoners. In the late 1980s, something remarkable happened. The South African government reached out to Nelson. They wanted to talk. The government knew they could no longer ignore the growing resistance. They hoped that by speaking with Nelson, they might find a way to calm the unrest. Nelson agreed to meet with them. He knew this was an opportunity to push for change. But he also made one thing clear. He would not compromise on his principles. "I cannot negotiate with a government that keeps my people oppressed," he said. "There will be no peace until apartheid ends." The talks were slow and difficult. The government wanted Nelson to call for an end to protests, but Nelson refused. He believed that the resistance must continue until true freedom was won. As the negotiations dragged on, the global movement for Nelson's release grew louder. Protests erupted in cities across the world. Universities, churches, and unions joined the fight. In South Africa, the chants of protesters filled the air. Release Mandela. End apartheid. These voices could not be ignored. Nelson Mandela had become a symbol of hope not just for South Africans, but for people everywhere who believed in justice. Inside prison, Nelson felt the weight of this responsibility. He knew that people looked up to him. He knew that his actions and words mattered. He often thought about a saying he had heard as a child. A leader is like a shepherd. He stays behind the flock, letting the most nimble go out ahead, whereupon the others follow, not realizing that all along they are being directed from behind. Nelson believed that leadership was not about power or control. It was about service. It was about guiding others toward a common goal. By 1990, the pressure on the South African government had become unbearable. The country was in chaos, and its leaders knew they had to change. President F.W. de Klerk made a historic announcement. Nelson Mandela would be released. The world held its breath. After 27 years in prison, Nelson Mandela was about to walk free. The long walk toward freedom was far from over. But this moment marked the beginning of a new chapter. Nelson's years of sacrifice, strength, and hope had not been in vain. The fight for justice had spread across the globe, and the dream of a free South Africa was closer than ever. Nelson Mandela's journey continued, and the world stood with him. Chapter 9. Freedom at Last. It was February 11th, 1990. The sun was bright, and the air buzzed with excitement. Crowds of people gathered on the streets of Cape Town, holding banners and singing freedom songs. They had waited for this day for 27 years. Nelson Mandela was going to walk free. Inside Victor Verster Prison, Nelson Mandela stood tall. He was 71 years old now, but his spirit was strong. The guards opened the gates. Nelson stepped forward, blinking in the sunlight. He looked calm, but inside, his heart raced. As he walked out, hand in hand with his wife, Winnie, a sea of people erupted into cheers. Thousands of hands waved in the air. People sang, danced, and shouted, "Viva Mandela!" The joy was overwhelming. Nelson paused for a moment. He raised his fist high in the air, a symbol of victory, of resilience, of freedom. The crowd roared even louder. Many wept, unable to hold back their tears. Nelson looked out at the faces before him. Black, white, young, old. People from all walks of life had come to see this historic moment. He smiled. This was not just his freedom. It was theirs too. The journey to this day had been long and painful. Nelson had spent 27 years in prison, away from his family and the world. He had missed watching his children grow up. He had endured loneliness, harsh conditions, and uncertainty. But he had never given up hope. From the stage set up for his speech, Nelson's voice carried across the crowd. I stand here before you not as a prophet, but as a humble servant of you, the people, he began. His voice was steady, full of emotion. Our struggle has reached a turning point. Apartheid must end. The crowd cheered again. Nelson continued, calling for peace and unity. We must not let hatred guide us, he said. We must work together to build a South Africa where all people can live in freedom and dignity. The words were powerful. They showed the kind of leader Nelson Mandela had become. He did not seek revenge. Instead, he wanted reconciliation. He knew that healing the nation would take time, patience, and love. But Nelson also knew the challenges ahead. South Africa was still divided. The apartheid government had not yet fallen. Violence between communities was rising, and trust was broken. The road to true freedom would not be easy. In the days following his release, Nelson met with leaders from all sides. He spoke with members of the African National Congress, ANC, urging them to remain united. He met with government officials, pushing them to begin dismantling apartheid. There were moments of tension. Not everyone agreed with Nelson's call for peace. Some wanted to fight back against the years of oppression with violence, but Nelson remained firm. Peace is the only path forward, he said. The media followed Nelson everywhere. Journalists from around the world wanted to hear his story. They asked him about his years in prison, his hopes for South Africa, and his plans for the future. Nelson answered thoughtfully, always focusing on unity and justice. At home, Nelson's release brought new challenges. His years in prison had taken a toll on his family. Winnie had been a strong voice for the struggle, but she had also faced her own battles. The two worked to rebuild their relationship, but the years of separation had created distance. Nelson also had to adjust to a world that had changed dramatically. Technology was different. The political landscape had shifted. Even the streets of Johannesburg were no longer the same. But Nelson embraced these changes with humility. In the months after his release, Nelson traveled across South Africa. Everywhere he went, people lined the streets to see him. They sang songs, waved flags, and shouted his name. For many, Nelson represented hope, the promise of a better future. But not everyone was happy about Nelson's freedom. Some in the white community feared what his release might mean. They worried that the end of apartheid would bring chaos. Nelson worked hard to ease their fears. "We do not want to push anyone out," he said. "South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white." Nelson's words began to build bridges. Slowly, people from different communities started to listen to each other. It was not easy, but Nelson's leadership inspired hope. In December 1993, Nelson Mandela and President F.W. de Klerk were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. The prize recognized their efforts to peacefully end apartheid. It was a proud moment for South Africa. Nelson stood on the stage in Oslo, Norway, and spoke with gratitude. "This prize is for all the people of South Africa who have worked tirelessly for freedom," he said. The road ahead is long, but together we can achieve peace. As 1994 approached, South Africa prepared for its first democratic elections. For the first time, black South Africans would be allowed to vote. Nelson Mandela, the man who had once been imprisoned for his beliefs, now stood as a candidate for president. The excitement in the country was electric. People lined up for hours to cast their votes. For many, it was the first time they had ever voted in their lives. On April 27, 1994, the election results were announced. Nelson Mandela had won. He would become South Africa's first black president. Standing before the crowd at his inauguration, Nelson Mandela took the oath of office. His voice was calm but filled with emotion. Never, never, and never again shall it be that this beautiful land will experience the oppression of one by another, he declared. The crowd erupted in cheers. South Africa had entered a new era. Nelson Mandela's release from prison was more than just a moment in history. It was the beginning of a journey toward healing and unity. The man who had walked out of Victor Verster prison on that sunny day in 1990 had become a symbol of resilience, forgiveness, and hope. The challenges ahead were great, but Nelson believed in the power of the people. Together, they could build the South Africa they had dreamed of, a nation where freedom truly belonged to everyone. Chapter 10. A Nation Votes. The year was 1994, and South Africa was about to change forever. For the first time in its history, people of all races would be allowed to vote. It was a moment millions had dreamed of, and Nelson Mandela stood at the heart of it. For decades, apartheid had silenced the voices of black South Africans. They had been denied the basic right to choose their leaders. But now, after years of struggle and sacrifice, that right was finally theirs. The air buzzed with excitement, hope, and the promise of a new beginning. On April 27, 1994, people lined up at voting stations across the country. Some had walked for miles to be there. Others had camped overnight, eager to cast their vote. The lines were long, so long that they stretched out of sight. But no one complained. They stood patiently under the hot sun or in the cool morning mist, determined to make history. For many, it was the first time they had ever voted. Elderly men and women who had lived their whole lives under apartheid stood beside young people, hopeful for a better future. Some cried as they dropped their ballots into the box. Others laughed and hugged one another. It was a moment of pure joy. Nelson Mandela cast his vote in a small school in his home province of KwaZulu-Natal. He wore a calm expression, but his heart was full. As he placed his ballot into the box, he smiled and said, "Today, we are taking the first step toward a South Africa that belongs to all." The election lasted for several days. When it ended, the counting began. Across the country, people held their breath, waiting for the results. The question was no longer if Nelson Mandela would win. The question was, by how much? When the final numbers were announced, it was clear Nelson Mandela had won by a landslide. The African National Congress, ANC, had received an overwhelming majority of the votes. Nelson Mandela would become South Africa's first black president. The news sent waves of celebration through the streets. People danced, sang, and waved flags. Children ran through the neighborhoods shouting, "Mandela! Mandela!" Strangers hugged one another, united by their shared joy. South Africa, a country once divided, was coming together. On May 10, 1994, Nelson Mandela stood on the steps of the Union Buildings in Pretoria. It was his inauguration day. Thousands of people filled the gardens, and millions more watched on television. World leaders from across the globe had come to witness the historic moment. As Mandela stepped forward to take the oath of office, the crowd fell silent. He placed his hand on the Bible and repeated the words that made him the president of South Africa. When he finished, the crowd erupted in cheers. Mandela's speech was powerful. His voice, steady and full of emotion, carried across the crowd. "We have at last achieved our political emancipation," he said. "We pledge ourselves to build a society in which all South Africans, both black and white, can walk tall, assured of their right to human dignity." He spoke about forgiveness and unity. He urged the people of South Africa to look forward, not back. "We must learn to live together as one nation," he said. "Let us not be defined by the past, but by the future we build together." It was not just words. Mandela's actions showed his commitment to unity. He reached out to the white minority, assuring them that they had a place in the new South Africa. He even invited former President F.W. de Klerk, who had helped end apartheid, to serve as his deputy president. This decision surprised many, but it sent a clear message. Mandela was a leader for all South Africans. Mandela also knew that healing the wounds of apartheid would take time. He helped create the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, a process where people could share their stories of pain and forgiveness. It was not easy. The testimonies were often heartbreaking, but Mandela believed it was necessary for the nation to heal. As president, Mandela focused on rebuilding South Africa. He worked to improve education, healthcare, and housing for black South Africans who had been neglected for so long. He encouraged foreign countries to invest in South Africa, helping to rebuild the economy. His vision was clear: a South Africa where everyone, no matter their race, had the opportunity to succeed. But the challenges were great. Poverty and inequality remained widespread. Violence between communities flared up, threatening the fragile peace. Mandela faced criticism from some who wanted faster change and others who resisted change altogether. Yet, he stayed true to his vision of a united nation. One of Mandela's most iconic moments as president came in 1995 during the Rugby World Cup. Rugby had long been seen as a sport for white South Africans, a symbol of the old apartheid regime. But Mandela saw an opportunity to bring the country together. When South Africa's team, the Springboks, made it to the final, Mandela surprised everyone. He walked onto the field wearing the green and gold jersey of the Springboks. The crowd, mostly white, was stunned. Then, slowly, they began to cheer. By the end of the match, they were chanting his name. South Africa won the game, but the real victory was the unity Mandela inspired. In that moment, he showed that symbols of division could become symbols of hope. He showed the world the power of forgiveness. Mandela's presidency lasted only one term. He chose to step down in 1999, believing that leadership should be shared, but his influence continued to shape South Africa and the world. The election of 1994 was more than just a political event. It was the birth of a new nation. A nation built on the principles of equality, justice, and freedom. For Nelson Mandela, it was the fulfillment of a lifelong dream. But he knew the work was not finished. The long walk to freedom has not ended, he often said. It is only beginning. Mandela's leadership during this time proved that even the deepest divisions can be healed with courage, wisdom, and love. The story of South Africa's first democratic election will forever be remembered as a triumph of the human spirit. Chapter 11. Leading with Love. Nelson Mandela became South Africa's first black president in 1994. It was a moment of triumph, but it was also a moment of great challenge. The country was deeply divided. The scars of apartheid were everywhere, in the homes, in the schools, and in the hearts of the people. Mandela knew that leading South Africa would not be easy, but he believed in one powerful idea: love. From the very beginning of his presidency, Mandela made it clear that his goal was not revenge. It was reconciliation. We must build a nation together, he said, black and white, rich and poor. We cannot move forward unless we are united. Mandela's kindness and forgiveness amazed the world. He reached out to those who had oppressed him, treating them not as enemies, but as fellow South Africans. One of the most famous examples of this was how he treated his former jailers. Soon after becoming president, Mandela invited a white prison guard from Robben Island to a special lunch. The man had been strict but fair to Mandela during his imprisonment. Now he was a guest of honor at the president's table. "You were part of my life," Mandela told him. "Now, let us be part of building this nation together." The gesture was small, but powerful. It showed that Mandela was serious about forgiveness. He did not hold on to bitterness. Instead, he used his past to teach others about hope and healing. Mandela also surprised many people when he supported the Springboks, South Africa's national rugby team. For years, rugby had been seen as a sport for white South Africans, a symbol of apartheid. Many black South Africans refused to support the team. But Mandela saw an opportunity. He believed that rugby could bring the country together. When the Springboks made it to the final of the Rugby World Cup in 1995, Mandela wore the green and gold jersey of the team. He walked onto the field and shook hands with the captain, Francois Pienaar, a white man. The crowd, mostly white, was stunned at first, but then they began to cheer. For a moment, it didn't matter if people were black or white. They were South Africans, united in their support for the team. The Springboks won the match, and Mandela's smile lit up the stadium. It was a moment of unity, a symbol of what South Africa could become. But Mandela's leadership was not just about grand gestures. He worked tirelessly to heal the everyday divisions in the country. He helped set up the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, a process where people could share their stories of pain and forgiveness. The commission allowed victims of apartheid to tell the truth about what had happened to them. It also gave perpetrators of violence a chance to confess their crimes. It was not an easy process. The stories were heartbreaking. Mandela himself listened to many of these stories.